thank you. Each of you is the honoree this morning from me to you. Or if you will, it's because of what you have each given me by tuning into Psalms. And what you've given me, which is part of the privilege of having been the rabbi now of CBI, is an audience, a context of teaching. And the Talmud will say regarding the cow, the mother cow, more than the calf needs to suckle, the mother needs to feel as if it's being suckled, that it's giving over, which is only to say the need to teach requires students, requires partners, and you've been my partners with both your comments and just your presence, motivating me, I dare say, not to cut corners in my preparation. And I'll talk a little bit about that today, what I've used as my resources in preparing these 150 Psalms. I could not have done this project without Zoom and without the mindset of COVID. Namely, when COVID began, it became clear I was not going to be doing a lot of traveling out and about. I wouldn't be able to have the normal rhythms of my rabbinate of visiting with people. And I wanted one last major project in my role as rabbi. I had taken on the challenge of Daf Yomi, the study of Talmud, for 7.5 years. I then did 5.5 years of Amud Zohar, the studying of Danny Matt's translation of the Zohar. And the last 2 years of doing Amud Zohar, I found myself drawn to Psalms and underlining in my little Psalm booklet wherever the Zohar had made reference to Psalms. My interest in Psalms is grounded in first prayer. We use Psalms in our daily prayer. We often sing the Psalms more actively on Shabbat with many beautiful melodies. And I knew the Psalms as that which we sang together as a community. But I had never studied the Psalms closely, except in my last semester of rabbinical school. I had a favorite teacher. I had many favorite teachers. And this teacher's name was Rabbi Simon Greenberg. And he was my homiletics professor, how to give a sermon. He'd been a vice president of the Jewish Theological Seminary, having been a rabbi at Har Zion in Philadelphia before that. And he shared he loved Psalms, and he made a point of reading all 150 Psalms every week. And he did it, he shared, by praying aloud for a good chunk of those Psalms, and he would make sure that every week he had gone through the Psalms. And so I asked him, along with a friend, if we could study Psalms with him, kind of 2-on-1 in his office, which at the seminary was unusual. You mostly spent time with your professors in a class. So it was a privilege to have this private time with him, and we studied Psalms. And later on, already in the pulpit, I continued to meet with another teacher of mine, and that was Rabbi David Lieber. And David Lieber, who was the president of University of Judaism, would go on to be the editor-in-chief of the Eitz Chaim, was another lover of Psalms. And he piqued my curiosity because I had such admiration for him as a Bible scholar. What was it about Psalms that he was drawn to? I had never studied poetry or much literature in college. And in that regard, this was a gap in my own Jewish learning and general learning. Dispositionally, I am a bit of a chassid in the Jack Reamer, Elie Wiesel sense, namely one who seeks to be moved by prayer. And I pause because my friend Jack Reamer on the screen also is a liturgist. And I'll come back to that. Somebody who's had the courage to write prayers that are part of our Machzor, that are part of the Siddur. Today, I am going to share my first publicly shared prayer that is inspired by you, my fellow learners of Psalms. Because what I wanted to do, and that'll be the major second half of today's presentation, is share with you what I sought to do in writing a psalm-like poem based on what I had gained from studying the Psalms these last 16 months. And so back to my own journey into Psalms. I had a couple weeks ago a member of a congregation in New York who represented the congregation that inspired me to start teaching Psalms, in that Sharon Kleinbaum, that rabbi of Beit Simcha in New York City, started teaching Psalms to her congregation at the start of COVID by Zoom. And she wrote to her congregation, that's what Jews traditionally do in a difficult time. We read Psalms. So I want to, she said, read Psalms with you. And when I saw that, having kind of moved or begun to move in that direction with my Zohar study and having finished that project, I thought, wow, this is my chance to teach Psalms and to teach a half-hour class, which I'd never in all my years in the rabbinate had the idea I could, have a half-hour class, because to get to synagogue is a half hour for most people. And to have a diverse audience via Zoom. And so we began already in March, the end of March of 2020, 16 months ago. One other influence on my love of Psalms is Rabbi Harold Kravitz. Not Rabbi Harold Kravitz, Rabbi Harold Kushner. Rabbi Harold Kravitz is also an inspiration, but Harold Kushner, who interestingly, many of you know his name from his book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. That's his best known. That was his commentary on the book of Job. He wrote a commentary also on Psalms, largely on Psalms, called Who Needs God? And of all the Harold Kushner books, and I read most of them, that one I found the most moving. And he again used Psalms. He did a doctoral dissertation as a younger man on the book of Psalms. And he also, in more recent years, wrote a separate book, a whole book on Psalm 23 called The Lord is My Shepherd, which I read when it came out. And every verse was a chapter in that book. And that's going back a few years. I'm again sharing my path to wanting to study Psalms. And it was a reminder of the depth of the imagery. That book particularly focuses on the choice of images and the power of the images of Psalm 23. And so we began together 16 months ago this journey. And here's what I've learned. First, what are Psalms? Psalms are poems to or in the presence of God. They are religious poems. In that sense, it's a distinctive kind of literature. When one is either talking to God or speaking out loud in the presence of God, one is remarkably honest, because God knows us, we can't lie, and more, we're given permission to speak openly and freely. Some Psalms, almost all the Psalms, are meant to be heard by others. They're not between the psalmist and God alone. They are poems that were meant to be shared. And yet, in the writing of the Psalms, what makes Psalms riveting for me is that quality of honesty. The honesty, again, of speaking before the supreme presence who created the world and who has an active engagement with those who call to God. That's the mindset of the traditional teaching of the Torah. That's the mindset of the Psalms. And not unlike Torah, which is, what's distinctive about Torah is that the personalities in Torah are struggling. Pick the patriarchs and the matriarchs. It's a story about their struggles, and the name Yisrael, B'nai Yisrael, are the people of struggle. And that's the other dimension that comes out of Psalms. Being in the presence of God means sharing struggles of enemies that would seek to destroy us, and suffering, depression, physical pain that comes with aging, and wonder and awe that comes from seeing one's creatureliness before God and the magnificence of creation, gratitude for the goodness in one's life, and much longing for both relief from all that worry and pain and for a better world. The Psalms, again, are powerful because the audience is God, or because it is about God, which draws our deepest emotions. The key emotions, somebody asked me, what are the prominent emotions? It's largely defeat of our enemies, gratitude for the goodness of the world, and longing for a better world. In the psalm themselves, in terms of structure, there's a lot of variety. There's a lot of variety in terms of length. Psalm 117, only 2 verses. Psalm 119, one of the 9 acrostics, 8 verses per 22 of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, 176 verses. When I printed that one out in my translation, it was 16 pages. The technique of the writing of a psalm is that every word matters. It's poetry on the highest level. These are the masterpieces that were distilled across time, across hundreds of years by community, and ultimately chosen by an editor or editors in terms of which would be part of the book of Psalms. And what these Psalms share is artistry. I didn't know that until this journey together. I didn't know how much the choice of words were purposeful, and the weave, the structure, was part of the message that the psalmist sought to convey. Often in psalms as poetry, there are rare words. Often, a new word for me in Latin, or is it Greek? Hapax legomenon, a word that's used nowhere else. I delighted in every hapax legomon that I came across. I just delighted in the idea of the freedom and the courage of the poet to create new words. And familiar words. Psalms are often collages, meaning they're taking phrases from other parts of the Bible that are evoking, by taking a phrase, a moment of the past, an event, and using it both to evoke the past and often with a novel turn. And so the echoing of other psalms within psalms, the echoing of scripture, of proverbs, of prophets, creates a kind of symphony. And at the same time, I found that every psalm was distinctive, that there was something about it, even when much of it was repeated, that gave it purpose. In that regard, part of the power of poetry is the use of images, the repeating of words for rhythm and for emphasis, with variation of meaning. And it became one of my pet reflexes is to look for the middle word of a psalm, not always, but more often than I would have known before, to be the bullseye of the psalm, something that is at the center of what the psalmist sought to convey, which is often different than the last line. And this Benjamin Siegel in particular pointed out to me, and that is the last lines of Psalms are often different than the rest of what came before it, either as a summation, but often as a surprise turn. And so a dimension of the artistry of Psalms, specifically as a poet style, is that the last line is a turn of where the psalm had been going, an element of surprise. The writing of psalms is often done with two halves of a verse having two different clauses, where the second half comes to either complement, to amplify, or contrast with the first part of the verse. That's a repeated style. And like all great poetry, the double and even triple entendre of meanings. Like, and I'll give this as an example, the word kol haneshama that we saw last Thursday of Psalm 150. In the Psalms, there's often a shift from the me to the we, the singular to the plural. The challenge of translation is something new to me. I had never translated the Bible per se, but it felt important to do because as I had my commentaries before me, what I also became aware of is how different the translations were from each other. And I smile because a pet peeve of mine have been those who would say, quote, but it says in the Bible, unquote, in reference to moral issues and legal issues. And I, as a rabbinic student, know that every verse of the 5 books of Moses needs interpretation, particularly the law. That law has more than one possible context, and therefore rules and statements can be read narrowly or broadly depending on goals. And so every interpretation, every translation of the Bible is an interpretation, a bridge of language, and variable, divergent, often utterly different, all the more in Hebrew. In Hebrew, we don't have capital pronouns. So you don't know if the he being referred to in a psalm is God or the enemy or the psalmist. And literally, some of the translations will interpret certain verses as referring to God and others referring to people, because the pronouns are ambiguous. It's also ambiguous as to what words mean. That's also the nature of poetry. All the more where rare words and hapax words are chosen. And so the challenge of translation was the translation of what do words mean, but also there is no punctuation in the original Hebrew. And where a clause ends and begins and who it refers to, here too, translators differ. They also differ, and this is probably the largest variation, in terms of tense. In Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, there's only 2 tenses. Perfect, which is present and past, and imperfect, which is present, future, and command or jussive. And sometimes the imperfect in biblical Hebrew can also be past. And so unlike English, where tense is clear, is this referring to the future or is this referring to the present? it's the translator's guess. And what I found with translations is some seek to create a translation that speaks to the English reader and fills in those uncertainties so that the reader can feel a certain flow, having made choices over ambiguities as to what words mean. Not a literal translation, but taking it one step further. And I'll add, Hebrew is a language with a limited vocabulary compared to English. Much more possibility of ambiguity and much more possibility for a translator to make choices as to what the nuance of a word signifies. And so I took a lot of time. My average translation was my fifth or sixth tweak, starting with a text that I found done in England. The layout was something called Mechorot Mamre, and I would then retranslate it. That simply gave me the Hebrew and English on either side. The English was often not the English of our place and time, but was a good foundation for me. And sometimes I was fascinated with the choices that were there as well. And I always made reference to the King James versions because that was helpful. So what are some of the commentaries that I used? I used Art Scroll. It's actually 2 volumes, meaning it's probably 1,700 pages in total. This is volume 1. And yeah, this is 900 pages. So this is only volume 1. And this is written by Orthodox in New York in recent decades, harvesting classic Jewish commentaries. And those commentaries were largely medieval and a window into how did Jews read the Psalms outside the time of the writing of Psalms in dispersion, often having 2 key orientations: taking it literal, that these were the Psalms of David, linking it therefore to specific events in David's life, more than modern scholars would, and being much more allegorical, midrashic, and playful on the other end, seeing Psalms as prophetic and speaking about the Messianic era. For Psalms, for Jews in the diaspora, were a source of comfort, of hope, of the return to Zion. And the temple, Zion, is such an important theme in Psalms. And with that, the opportunity to read Psalms as a promise not only of what was, but what yet will be. I turned to Wikipedia. Wikipedia has a separate entry for every psalm, and that's where I often harvested where psalms were used in the sweep of music and literature, how Christians use the psalms, because the psalms which are in Ketuvim, the latter writings of Hebrew scripture, are also used by Christians. And so I found Wikipedia that which often gave me associations to Psalms in our more broad world that I found enlightening and deeply satisfying. Many of those translations and commentaries, just to do a quick survey, Richard Levy, he was the head of HUC, Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles, the Reform Rabbinical School. He has a translation that seeks to recreate alliteration, one of the poetic devices. He's very focused on the sound. Robert Alter, in his wonderful translation also, but different than Richard Levy, in that Robert Alter tries to stay closer to the original Hebrew, but he's very concerned about things being concise and rhythmic, because the Hebrew of Psalms is very sound oriented. It's short, it's rhythmic. That's part of its power. And Robert Alter, with his sensitivity to poetry and language, and his commentary, an important teacher. Martin Cohen has an interesting perspective. I found his translations a little bit too filling in the blanks. But as Benjamin Siegel said, what's interesting about it is he starts with the question, what is the prompt for the psalmist? And then tries to write the psalm from that point of view, from the key question. And I learned Mark Brettler, a important contemporary Bible scholar, has a commentary in the Oxford publication on the Bible that gives good, what he was particularly strong at for me, Mark Brettler, is pointing out the collage quality of Psalms. Where else in Psalms a verse is found? Nachum Sarna, the great Bible scholar, taught at Brandeis, where Mark Brettler also taught, has a book on about 6 different Psalms, but in depth in terms of the origins of Psalms and the Canaanite mythological underpinnings. Creative writings of translation, Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who truly defines contemporary creativity, but I found his translations already a little dated. They're a little bit too contemporary, writing his translations in the 60s and 70s, a little bit too cool. There's a great Zen teacher who also did a translation, whose name is going to pop for me in a moment. A good survey for commentaries, Martin Rosenberg and Bernard Zlotowitz. Orthodox translations, Adin Steinsaltz, the Mitsuda, and the Gutnick edition with commentaries by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson. And for prayer, Eddie Feld has a book. He's the editor of our Sidur, Lev Shalem. The commentaries and the margins of Lev Shalem are very valuable as psalm as prayer. And he has a book of about a dozen psalms that I found helpful. And last, having been pointed in that direction, and that's the concordance, which I actively used after Robert Alter in a public conversation pointed out how he relied on that. In terms of favorite psalms, and I'm already at 10, and I want to share with you the psalm I wrote. Probably I start with Psalm 1, and that's because there too, it was a psalm that Rabbi Harold Kushner had written about in Who Needs God, Who Knows God. I love the image, which is also in Jeremiah, of the righteous having deep roots by flowing waters, in contrast to the wicked who are like sagebrush getting blown about. Probably my favorite is Psalm 23, and I'm going to talk about that. Others are Psalm 92, the Psalm for Shabbat. Psalm 145, I loved Rabbi Reamer's teaching to the Canners Assembly, in which he helped teach me why Psalm 145 is the most sung, most repeated psalm 3 times a day. Psalm 150, which together we did last Thursday, was such a moment of elation for me. I love its use of the orchestra of God, of 9 instruments culminating with every living breath. Each of the psalms, I could go on and on, but I want to focus on my psalm only because it's something different. I will say 3 teachings that pop out as particularly memorable for me. One was Psalm 101, which I did with my wife's cousin, David Lang. David had written music for Psalm 101 and a libretto that was performed at Lincoln Center. I'm a big fan of David, who I've known since I've known Linda. He's one of the great contemporary classic composers. It was fun for me to hear how David wrote the libretto out of Psalm 101 as part of this Festival of Psalms, and how he writes music, which is repeating the words over and over, often while walking, until a melody begins to emerge. I still want to try it with the psalm I'm going to share with you in a moment. I loved Rabbi Eddie Feinstein's commentary to Psalm 137 by the Rivers of Babylon. And with Tisha B'Av just this last Saturday night and Sunday, I was looking through my file and became aware that I didn't know the last 3 lines of Psalm 137, which are those brutal lines of, happy is the person who throws their children against a rock. And it was Rabbi Feinstein who pointed that out to me in a conversation, which is why I would then ask him to be the honoree for Psalm 137. And the way he broke it down into the 9 verses into 3 units, I found a great gift to me and to us. And last, I was elated and surprised by the sense of joy last Thursday when Craig Taubman joined us with his emotionally ecstatic singing of Psalm 150 that he did along with the prayer leader from Saddleback, another man named Rick. And those 3 recordings, 101, 137, and 150, I think are particularly memorable for me. And so now I'm going to share the psalm I wrote. But first I pause again because it's so important to me. This will be the second time, and I hope to have a third, to say thank you to each of you. It is your presence that has put, as I keep saying, wind in my sails that have allowed me to get to this point. And so the psalm that I wrote has a context. And the context first is that I collect oil lamps. This is the lamp in the photo. I used to have them here, but I'm slowly moving out. And I have a collection. It's been an indulgence over the last 15, 20 years. I have about 15 of these oil lamps. They are, for me, a survey of biblical history. The oldest probably is the time of Abraham, time of Moses, time of David, into the Second Temple, and Herod's period, Maccabees. So I have 15 that are that sweep of history. And what I was drawn to by having these oil lamps is, one, they were the technology of the ancient world. And as an ancient world, that technology changed very slowly. There were also utility art and folk art. And this one you can see has some work on the clay to make it a little nicer. But they're made from clay. They're made from the soil. They're fragile. They break. They're hard to find whole. Usually in tombs, I imagine, these whole ones. And so I call my psalm as a lamp of dust. And what I saw in the Psalms is the need for an evocative image. And for me, I began somewhat with this. It kind of popped. I've been sitting with it, waiting for something to emerge. And I liked it because it's like the human body. You know, we say from dust to dust. This is from dust. And at the same time, it's a vessel of light. And we have that image also in Proverbs, that the soul of a person is the light of God, and that we are that spark within us, that holy spark. We are lamps of God. And so let me first read it in Hebrew. You'll see it's not that long. And what I was mindful in writing it is that there should be no more words than needed, and some word plays. So first in Hebrew, then in English, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what I sought to convey. Elohai, lefanai v'ta'aluma, יצרת אותי כמנורת עפר, כשמן זית, כציר הטבע והניסיון אישי, תורת עמך ועולמך. תאיר אותי בהבנה ובאהבה, ובמעלות טובות כזוהרת חסד ואמת. תדריך אותנו לשרת ולברך את עולמך ואת שמך. אנא יחד אותנו בכבוד ובשלום, מעתה ועד עולם. Hallelujah. As a lamp of dust, my God, before me and a mystery, you fashion me as a lamp of dust, as olive oil, harvest of nature and personal experience, Torah of your people and your world. Illuminate me with understanding and love and uplifted goodness as the glow of kindness and truth. Guide us to serve and to bless your world and your name. Please unite us with respect and peace from now and forevermore. Hallelujah. And so this is more prayerful than many of the Psalms. There are prayers that are Psalms too, but sometimes and often Psalms are written in a moment of tension and conflict. This is broader and more what I'm used to doing, which is, as you know, I often end my sermons talking to God. This is more me talking to God as a prayer that begins with me and then shifts to we. For I am part of a larger community. I started with Elohai, my God, and then I thought of using the Yud He Vav He, the Adonai. I use Yud He Vav He daily in my meditation as part of my imagery. Yud is head, He is arms, Vav is spine, He is the lower part of the body. It's the way I focus myself in daily meditation as part of my daily prayer. But at the same time, it felt to me too strong to start with calling God all the more in a public sense by Yud He Vav He, even presumptuous. And so I went back to Elohai, which felt more personal. Here I wanted to convey a mystery and a tension. Before me and mystery. And the tension is, and it's something Peter Pitzley, one of our honorees, in writing a book called Wrestling with God, referred to God in that book as presence and mystery. And I loved that tension between the intimacy and the immediacy of God and the sense of the otherness with a capital O for God. And I originally had different ways of doing Lefanai Ta'aluma, and I wrote it Lefanai V'chida. Chida is a puzzle. And I wrote the English translation, and I shared this back to Psalms being a collaborative achievement. I'm not sure if it's an achievement, but a collaborative effort. I shared it with Mike Myman, Rabbi Myman, who often joins us because he's a native Israeli speaker. And he said Chida is more often a puzzle, and I should consider the word V'ta'aluma, a word I didn't know. Here's what I love about the word V'ta'aluma. It only occurs one other time in Psalms, but it does occur once. It's in Psalm 44, verse 22. Hello, Elohim, behold God, Yachar Zot, who will investigate this, Ki hu yodea talumot lev, for he, God, knows all the ta'alumot, all the secrets of the heart. And here it's a bit flipped on two counts. One, when I use the word lefanai, that's often how we refer to God. Ani omed lefanecha, or yivarechecha. So lefanecha means before God, and here I'm saying God is before me. I'm flipping it, not intentionally, which is to say, as a modern, I'm often starting with myself more than maybe the ancients did. V'ta'aluma, here too is a flip. It's used once in Psalms, but used only 2 other times in Hebrew scripture, that word. And it's in Job 11:6 and Job 28:11. And in both senses, it deals with secret things, not necessarily God being secretive or God being the source of the mystery. And so here too it's getting flipped. It's using the word v'taluma to describe God rather than in Psalm 44:22, our secrets that we hold. And I don't think it's intentional, but now that it's there, I find something poetic about it in terms of the relationship with God going 2 ways and starting with ourselves. Yitzarta oti, you fashion me, also has the word Yitzar of creation. God is the creator. He's the Yitzar, the fashioner. Kimnorat afar, as a lamp of dust, and I spoke about light and that being spirit and God's presence, and simultaneously, and I like tensions, that this is of dust, that which is like the human body, that which is fleeting, that which is of the soil. And yet, the oil to do the lamp needs to be olive oil. Olive oil to me suggests the land of Israel, antiquity. Tom Friedman wrote a book called The Lexus and the Olive Tree. That was his first book about globalization. The Lexus was the first car made entirely by robots, and the olive tree for him represented a claim of soil to my land, tribalism. So in the Bible is identified with olive oil. That's the oil used in the temple. The menorah was olive oil. But the nature of an olive distinctly is, I used to harvest olives on kibbutz in my youth. They don't taste good when you pick them. You have to work them. I mean, grapes taste good even before they become wine. Olives taste awful until they're pickled, which is to say, a olive, let alone olive oil, is a partnership between the gifts God has provided and human culture. And so, for me, who I am as Eli is this coming together of teva, of the natural, the DNA I was given, the seed that I was from conception, and nisayon ishi, my own personal experiences. And here I sought to be double entendre, Torah mecha, the Torah of your people. I wanted to use a Hebrew word rather than the teachings of your people. I initially did it as teachings. But then I said, I want the Hebrew because I shouldn't be shy about being Jewish in my words to God. We live at a time where our natural move as Jews is to be universal. And a psalm is often begins and is grounded in the particular. And so I felt Torah mecha. But at the same time, the ambiguity of who is a mecha. It can be all peoples. All the more when juxtaposed with the mecha, your world. So is amecha all peoples or just the Jewish people? That's ambiguous, and intentionally so. The request of God, ta'ir oti, illuminate me, which the word or, which goes to the image of the menorah, which has or in it, is to be illuminated, to fulfill my purpose. All the more if I am a menorah, the purpose is la'ir, to be light, to evoke light. and that I call on God, because it's a prayer, to do so with Havana. And Bina, in the Jewish mystical tradition, is the capacity of words. Ben is to, Bina. Chesed is love, and Bina is the ability to give it structure, to articulate it. Because knowledge begins with words, but is ultimately expressed or needs to be expressed with love. That's what it means to be lit up. And b'ma'alot tovot, initially I wrote b'midah tova, and my wife is the one who contributed. She has remarkable talents, including Hebrew sensitivities. One of her interests, and she's been studying Duolingo everyday Yiddish. And in Yiddish, you say ala malas. If you want to say a person was great, you say they were with all the attributes. Ala malas, ma'alot. Ma'alot is attributes. And ma'alot tovot is also a double entendre. It's with being elevated to goodness, because that is the light, that we should be elevated. So it's playing on light. And tovot. And I double checked with Rabbi Reamer the difference between midot tovot and malot tovot, and he said basically they're synonyms. In Musar, and I've studied a lot of Musar, character education in Judaism, they use the word midah, but here in some, I then changed it to malot tovot, because it was more evocative of light going up, more evocative of elevation. And therefore, I chose a word that's somewhat original and creative. The word Zohar means glow or light or illumination. Kizoharat, as is the lighting or glow of kindness and truth. And throughout Psalms, Chesed ve'emet is what's used to describe God. Back to the mystical tradition, they are seen as opposites in dialectic. Chesed is love or kindness. Emet is judgment, gevura, restraint, deen, law, and that you need both chesed, kindness, and restraint, truth, to create compassion, which is tiferet. And tiferet, compassion, equals in Sfirot, the heart. And now I shift to the plural. Tadrich otanu, guide us. And that's the word derech, to have a way. That's Psalm 1, where God provides the way of the righteous. L'sharet u'levarech, to serve and to bless. Et olamecha v'et shemecha, your world and your name. And both of those are counterparts. Serve and bless, one seems to suggest action, the other more words, but it's performative words. Your world and your name, and ultimately the world is God's name, or emblematic of God's presence. And the closing line, Anna yachad otanu. I originally wrote na for please. Mike Myman suggested Anna. I took his suggestion as being a little bit broader in, it's more like the royal we, in terms of the royal please. Anna yachad otanu, please unite us. B'chavodu b'shalom, with respect, and that's ambiguous. We are to see ourselves as worthy of respect. My teacher, Abe Tversky, says his 60 books come down to one word: you are worthy of being loved. Uve shalom, which can be how we get along with each other and also how we are within ourselves, whole and complete. enabling us to come together. So both are here, personal and communal. Me'ata v'ad olam, a phrase that's often in Psalms with the emphasis of when, and that's now. I want that now, and I want it to continue. And last, it seemed to me one of the lessons of Psalms is that our purpose in life is to praise God. That's why God created us. The word hallelujah only appears in the fourth and fifth books of Psalms. It's only toward the end of Psalms. But it clearly lingered for me from last Thursday with that elation of the singing of Kol Neshama Hallelujah, Hallelujah. And it felt right to proclaim at the end with an exclamation, praise be Yah. Praise be God. Praise be the source of life and light and our ability to express our words. And so that's my psalm, light poem, K'menorat Afar, as a lamp of dust. We're a little over time, but any thoughts, any reactions that you would like to share for a few moments? Go ahead, Mimi. Let me stop the share so that I can see who might be raising a hand. Go ahead, Mimi. Got to unmute, Mimi.
Sorry, I thought I did. So after I read it, I did what you often do, and I looked for the middle.
Yes.
Yes, which I'm sure that you have done, but it's in English, and uplifted goodness, and which I think, to me, that's such a beautiful image, and we could get the other ideas so that phrase kind of symbolizes your whole psalm. I did
have a
notice,
question in that regard, Mimi.
Yeah.
Was that the count in the English or in the Hebrew?
Hebrew.
Okay, yes, because I counted it in Hebrew too for that very reason. I was aware of how much emphasis I gave to the middle, and in fact, I tweaked it, and it just worked out that that was the middle.
Oh, perfect.
But I tweaked it because I didn't like where the middle had been before, and I said, that's the right middle. I'm building on your comment, Mimi, in that the middle is actually between those two words.
Yes.
Because it's 42 words exactly.
Yeah.
So it's right in the middle, and that means in the most recent translation, where it's ma'alot tovot, it's elevation of goodness. And that's the bullseye, is that it is a prayer about being elevated toward goodness.
So you had said that actually the we part starts later, but I noticed that the Hebrew is in the plural. Ma'alot tovot.
Yeah. Well, it's in the, yeah, but it's also double entendre because we say that we have many qualities of good. And so it can be read either way. What I learned from Psalms is the more multiple possibilities, that's better for poetry. Sometimes intentional and not always. I remember the first poetry reading I ever went to, which was a freshman, may have been my first week or two of college, was a poetry reading in which I shared this once in the past with the group, but somebody was asked, was this what you intended, speaking to a poet? And the poet said, it doesn't matter what I intended. Whatever you find as a reader is worthy of what the poem hoped to create. So with that, Deidre, you have your hand up, and then Rabbi Jack. Deidre, only because I saw you first, and then my teacher, Rabbi Reamer.
This might be longer than a brief discussion, but I'm curious as to like your word choice. When you pick your world, the 2 times in this psalm, what prompted you to use that particular descriptor instead of, say, Eretz or Adamah? Why pick Olam, which we tend to think of as like an age or eon or whatnot?
You're asking such an important question. Let me show you what I felt good about. And this is first Deidre's question, is I use the word, Torat amecha, the teaching of your people and your world. And now the word olam is here both physical, your world, it'll get repeated, and olamecha, we serve and bless your world and your name. So olamecha is a second time. And then I use the word olam a third time. But here, va'ad olam is the last word, refers to time rather than space. And now, but I particularly, and I'm not that smart, but it just worked out that way, the envelope of this psalm is the sound olam, because the word that Mike Myman gave me, the ta'aluma, has embedded in it the word olam, because another meaning of olam is hidden or disappearing. Ne'alam means what has disappeared, which means, before me and hidden. So here I have 4 uses of the same root with 3 different meanings, which makes it psalm-like. That's, of course, a technique of psalms, and I delighted when I saw that unfold. So, particularly with Mike's edition of Rabbi Myman, the ta'aluma, that enabled this to have the inclusio of it in the beginning and the end. Only because of lack of time. Thank you, Deidre. That was a wonderful sensitivity on your part. But I'm going to give the last word to my teacher, Rabbi Reamer. And I'm going to pause to say a word. I delighted when I gave Craig Taubman on Thursday the last word, and he said, no, I defer. I'd like Rabbi Reamer to have the last word, which was a statement of Craig's humility and his mindfulness, which is also my mindfulness. And that is, Jack, you are for us who know you an inspiration. And as Craig deferred, so to have you have the last word for me of this journey is a great privilege, because both in your courage to write prayer, but in your steadfast love of learning, which is the appetite that is so much who you are, you give me joy. And so, Rabbi Reamer, the last word.
It's a very great and undeserved honor. Thank you. But I noticed the word nisayon echoes the Akedah. It echoes the sense not of the experience, but of test.
Mm-hmm.
That's what many experiences in life are. Maybe that's the way to look at the things that happen to us. That's a minor detail, the minor nuance.
Well, it's not minor. And I want to just share everybody what Rabbi Reamer is referring to. And that is what I say here, Kitzir Hateva, the harvest of nature, Vahanisayon isi, and the personal experience. Rabbi Reamer emphasizes that this word, nisayon, translated as experience, in Hebrew means a variety of things that have a biblical association. And that is, Abraham is tested. It's called a nes. That's one meaning, that life tests us. The other element of test is that it's a banner. So a nes is a source of identity. Each tribe had a banner, a nes, that was used for self-definition. And in that sense, this word, nisayon, conjures up not only experience of what's happened to us, but as a psalm-like poem, links to the Bible and the various tests, particularly that most profound test of Abraham, both in the beginning, being called without being told the destination, and the sacrifice of his son, and further along, the tribes emerging with identities, and that each of us have identities that are a product of our personal experience, which is the contrast to what occurs in nature, which is impersonal. So the personal and the impersonal are there as well. I will say, not conscious on my part, but I am delighted, Jack, and will hold on to it, to your insight of what gives that word a greater biblical resonance and makes this poem to God more grounded in the continuity of Torah, which is the next line. And so I will continue to play with this psalm. I don't want to linger because I know people have different needs, and I try to stay within the time. It's already 10:31. Again, this psalm learning today is dedicated to each of you. I am so grateful to each of you. You each have given me motivation, and not just motivation to teach, but to teach with my best. I didn't cut corners, and I had the luxury of time over COVID where I really looked up everything that I thought I would want to look up to come to conclusions. And that was because I felt accountable to you. And so many of you, each of you, have a remarkable story. My being able to honor many of you, most of you, as honorees served a variety of reasons. I had never done that either in my teaching. I learned that from Ari Katz. It was an opportunity for me to bring to the foreground each of you, and for me to highlight for each other how remarkable each of you are to me, and how remarkable the student body is as a group. Just because each of you is a distinctive, curious person. You're each self-selected to study. And it's been a delight to introduce you to each other by having honorees. And by having you as honorees has added to my sense of gratification, that it's a kind of gift that I could give to, say to somebody, I want to dedicate what I've been working on to you in this public setting. And that added to my sense of purpose. So today, each of you are the honorees. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's been a joy to have this journey. Do, if you will, put on your Facebook page that you've been on this journey. Refer people to the portfolio for them to share. Maybe pick as an example a favorite one of these recordings to invite people to hear. I could go on and on. Thank you. My love, my gratitude.